Solange, não falei com Solange ainda. Tudo bem.
Hello.
Hello, Solange. Sim.
Okay, John?
Okay, já entramos. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening in Britain, although the sun is still shining in London in one of the longest days, Midsummer's Day. And our question de lingua inglesa, literatura de lingua inglesa, our question today, everything will be in English, and the format will be a little bit different. We've invited Professor Gregory Dart from University College London to speak on what the Romantics have to offer us today. The format will be as following. I'll be handing over to Daniel Lago Montero in a few seconds. Daniel will then make another introduction to Professor Dart. Professor Dart will speak for, how long have you prepared? 40, 50, 60 minutes?
About 40.
About 40 minutes. Danielle will then comment on Professor Dart's talk, and afterwards we'll be opening up for questions from the public. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can put them in English or Portuguese or any other language we understand on the YouTube. Okay, so I'm handing over to Danielle now. Danielle.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So the question that we have now, as John said, what have the Romantics to offer us today? So just a brief introduction. British Romanticism is often circumscribed between two historical milestones. On the one end, the beginning of the French Revolution, 1789. On the other, the Great Reform Act of 1832. Within this period, characterized by Eric Hobsbawm, among others, as the Age of Revolution, Britain witnessed a profound change in its system of belles lettres. While the first generation of Romantic poets, with William Wordsworth at its head, set the aim to start poetry anew, leaving aside its commonplace figures, the second generation, Byron, Shelley, Keats, gave a different turn to classical allusions and Greek mythology. But changes were not exclusively to poetry. The prose writers of the age, working with fiction, non-fiction, or forms that blurred such distinction, dwelt on social class divisions, the unconscious, nostalgia, and numberless other issues still pressing to this day. Therefore, and to a better comprehension of the period's legacy, we put forward the question, what have the Romantics to offer us today? To answer it, we have invited a leading specialist on the topic, Professor Gregory Dart, from the University College London. Gregory Dart spent his undergraduate and graduate years from 1886 to 1993 at the University of Cambridge. Since 2000, he has been a professor at University College London. His books include Rousseau, Robespierre in English, Romanticism, 1999, and Metropolitan Art and Literature, 1810-1840, Cockney Adventures, 2012, both published by Cambridge University Press. His teaching range at UCL focuses on the Romantics and Victorians, but also includes 20th century literature and film, the 18th century, and Shakespeare. Gregory Dart's research, both current and prospective, is centrally concerned with Romanticism, the city, and the history and development of the essay from Montaigne to the modern period. He's currently chair of the Hazlitt Society and a member of the Charles Lamb Society. For several years now, Dart has been working on 3 volumes of a new 6th volume collected edition of the works of Charles and Mary Lamb, Oxford University Press, for which he's also general editor. In addition to his literary interests, Dart has also written 16 essays for the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, for use in their programs, DVDs, and online. So now, Professor Gregory Dart, it's all yours. So I believe you need me to share the screen, or just wait or should I wait for a while?
You can do it now if you like. That would be great. Yeah,
okay.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah. And and that's fantastic. Yeah, great.
I just muted myself. I forgot about that.
And yeah, whoops, you need to make it big as well. Wonderful. Okay, so
that's fine.
I'll nudge you now and again, Daniel, to change the slide, right? Yeah.
Sorry?
Every now and again, I'll nudge you to change the slide.
Okay,
right?
perfect. Because I won't be seeing you. That's the thing. I'll be saying just...
No, but you'll be listening.
Okay, great. Okay.
Right. Yeah, great. Well, I must thank you so much for having me. I need to tell you what an honor it is to be asked to give such a talk to thinkers and writers in Brazil, and it's very exciting for me. And I hope that this will be intelligible, and that I don't go too fast. If I'm going too fast, just tell me. Okay, so what do the Romantic poets have to offer us today? That's the brief that I've been given. In order to answer this question, I am, of course, going to sing the virtues of certain writers. But before I do that, I'm also going to say what might make them romantic, what it is they have in common, to my mind, at least. Approached in the wrong spirit, Romanticism can be notoriously difficult to define. One will come unstuck if one tries to link it too strongly to political radicalism or conservatism or a love of nature or a longing for the past. This is because among the English Romantics especially, there are reactionaries as well as revolutionaries, progressivists as well as primitivists. English Romanticism was not a party nor an organized movement. It was nothing more than a set of contemporaries who wrote for and against each other, passionately responsive people who lived through the same eventful time. One way of defining Romanticism is in terms of the awareness of a predicament, the predicament of modernity. The French Revolution had a lot to do with this, not the outbreak of it as such, but the failure of it, and the concomitant realization that the Enlightenment had crashed, as it were, run aground. Romanticism is, from the beginning, haunted by the sense, a sense born in the 1790s, that the past and the idea for a perfect society that it contained was irrecoverable, and that the future might have no destination. So the optimism of the Enlightenment crashes in the 1790s. Taken together, this insight leads, I think, into a greater rather than lesser investment in past forms and ideals. They take on an uncanny Gothic quality. So part of what Romanticism has to offer, I think, is a very special relationship to the past. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please, Daniel. So, in illustration of this, let me show you an image of London by the German émigré artist Georg Scharf, an image of the building of New London Bridge alongside the dismantling of the old. It took a romantic sensibility, I would argue, to see a pictorial subject in this disorganized scene. One can see that Scharf is hugely interested in the shadow that the newly new casts upon the old, how it makes us view the old in a new light. This Janus-faced ambivalence is, it seems to me, truly romantic, a curious double prospect of ruin and progress. Okay, can we have the next slide then, please, Daniel? Unlike neoclassicism, Romanticism is very eclectic, aesthetically speaking. It's not a historical style in itself, but a new way of thinking about historical style. It is a new conception of history. One way of approaching this is to think of Romanticism as a house museum, in fact, which has all the relics of earlier cultures in it, Gothic, classical, African, Asian, It has Hogarth paintings in one room and a shrine to Shakespeare in another. Chinese vases in the drawing room and an Egyptian sarcophagus in the basement. We have the next slide, please. The house is a jumble of things from different places and provenances, things that don't seem to go together, but in which one is invited to hunt for a hidden unity. And the strange thing is that when you walk round this house, especially on your own, you get a very distinct impression. A light shines from above that makes everything look different, with the objects themselves seeming to shift and change as you move from room to room. Okay, next slide. There are strange turns and distorting mirrors everywhere. What is foregrounded, in fact, is the subjectivity of all perception, of the unstable theatrical relationship between subject and object, past and present, viewer and viewed. Okay, next slide, please. This house museum, it should be said, has a real existence. You'll have guessed this by now. It's called the Soane Museum, and it's located in a quiet square in central London. Like Coleridge, Keats, and Shelley's poetry, the former house of the Romantic architect John Soane is full of objects, classical and medieval, Shakespearean, and contemporary. But precisely as with Keats's Grecian urn, the primary interest is not in what these objects are in themselves as archaeological or artistic artifacts, but in the viewer's curious, uncanny, increasingly fraught and thought-sick relation to them. Romanticism, one realizes, is not defined by its preference for Gothic over Greek or Greek over Gothic, but in its strange new attitude to both. In sum, it is about the sheer imaginative excitement of recognizing that one lives in a curious, ruined world, a modern world in which all the traditional paradigms have shifted, but where one remains possessed by the past. Okay, what can Romanticism teach us today? Well, I think Romanticism's great insight, and it did come mostly out of the failure of the French Revolution, was that the Enlightenment was not all it cracked up to be. Or, to put it in another way, that perfectibility, the gradual but inevitable improvement of human life and society, was not by any means a given. It was not automatic. Hamlet is an early Romantic speaking to an Enlightenment rationalist when he tells Horatio that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in his philosophy. The most succinct account of this need to think again, I think, is not English but German, and is contained in Friedrich Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, 1794. Confronted by the failure of the revolution, the letters were written in the year of Robespierre's terror. Schiller acknowledged that the Enlightenment was in trouble. People were clearly not ready to follow reason in and for itself. So much so, indeed, that they might need to be coaxed into following it by a virtuous seductress called art. Schiller was not alone in seeing a new and more important role for art in the aftermath of the revolutionary terror. It is one of the linchpins of Romantic sensibility to see art as no longer a mere plaything of the idle rich, but as a crucial motor of human progress, the last best chance of saving the world. Romanticism, then, is the label that we might give to this recognition that the workings of the world are more complicated than the Enlightenment had envisaged. This realization can take a radical form, as in Shelley or Hazlitt, or a conservative one, as in Burke or the later Coleridge. But its defining feature is probably its spirited opposition to rationalism in its most narrow and arrogant forms. Utilitarianism, Malthusian theory, classical political economy, all of which were Anglo-French in origin. But what this categorically does not mean is that Romanticism is an irrationalism, a repudiation of reason. It is, on the contrary, a dialectical critique of the Enlightenment notions of reason, an urgent exposure of their philistinism and inflexibility. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please, that would be great. Oh yeah, and the slide after that. Sometimes, of course, Romanticism can sound a bit like primitivism, a back to nature ethos, as in these lines from Wordsworth's lyrical ballads. One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. Sweet is the law which nature brings. Our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things we murder to dissect. Enough of science and of art. Close up these barren leaves, the leaves of books, he means. Come forth and bring with thou a heart that watches and receives. But what it is important to realize, I think, is that this poem and this sentiment is part of a dialogue. Wordsworth himself was not anti-science. He was, however, mistrustful of the unholistic tendency in contemporary scientific thinking, its narrow analytic spirit. We murder to dissect, he writes, by which he means we destroy what we inquire into if our inquiry is conducted in the wrong spirit. Okay, if we could have the next slide. And it was in this respect that he saw a new role for poetry as the proper spirit of inquiry. And this is Wordsworth. The man of science seeks truth as a remote and unknown benefactor. He cherishes it and loves it in his solitude. The poet, singing a song in which all human beings join with him, rejoices in the presence of truth as our visible friend and hourly companion. Poetry is the breath and finer spirit of all knowledge. It is the impassioned expression which is in the countenance, the face of all science. Emphatically may it be said of the poet, as Shakespeare hath said of man, that he looks before and after. He is the rock of defense of human nature, an upholder and preserver, carrying everywhere with him relationship and love. What lurks behind this passage, of course, is an awareness of the increasing proliferation of disciplines in the modern age, the continuing fracture of knowledge into ever more separate, hermetically sealed categories: chemistry, biology, physics, medicine, engineering, political economy, philology. Poetry, Wordsworth argues, is the only activity that includes a love of the world, which is the basis of all human inquiry, in its very mission statement. For him, it is the science that grounds and humanizes the rest. Romanticism is a great conversation about the nature of everything between progressivists and conservatives. Godwin, Burke, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Wollstonecraft, Hazlitt, Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, Sir Walter Scott, Byron. It is an intellectual but also a social conversation. Very fortunate in an English context that a lot of these people knew one another. So the relationship between them is not merely intellectual, it's kind of social. They also fell out a lot, they were angry with each other, but that just heats the argument. One of Romanticism's key desires, I think, is to keep the avenues of association open, the links between poetry and philosophy, politics and theatre, art and science. Such was the division of knowledge in early 19th century modernity that these discourses were beginning to drift apart from each other. The period 1800 to 1860 was probably the last time in which the struggle to keep things together, to see life steadily and to see it whole, was still being attempted. Romanticism can, to this degree, be seen as a predecessor of modern-day ecological thinking, not only because it was concerned for the environment, recognizing for the first time that the resources of nature were not infinite, but also because it was so committed to holistic, interdisciplinary thinking, to thinking across the newly forming boundaries, those steadily reifying categories of knowledge. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please. Much of the struggle in the best Romantic period writing is an attempt to keep the increasingly divergent strands of human interest and experience in dialogue with one another, high and low, sensual and metaphysical. This is what Charles Lamb noticed in his friend William Hazlitt's essays, its desire to bridge gaps, transcend boundaries. If he enters upon some distinction too subtle and recondite to be immediately understood, Lamb wrote, he relieves it by some palpable and popular illustration. In fact, he all along acts as his own interpreter and is continually translating his thoughts out of their original metaphysical obscurity into the language of the senses and of common observation. This appears to us to constitute the excellence and to account for the defects of his writings. The thought and the illustration do not always hang well together. The one puzzles, the other startles. From this circumstance, it is that to too many people, Mr. Hazlitt appears an obscure and unconnected, and to others a forced and extravagant writer. He may be said to paint caricatures on gauze or cobwebs, to explain the mysteries of the Kabbalah by Egyptian hieroglyphics. So this quotation helps explain, I think, the extraordinary ambition of the best Romantic period writing, but it also helps explain its vertiginous quality, its great riskiness, its continuing proximity to curious comparison and overreaching. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please. There we go. That's just an image of the manuscript that I'll be talking about. Maybe we can go on to the onto the next one after that. One great example of this, it seems to me, or what one might call this will to translate, this will to associate, is one of John Keats's first great poems, written when he was only 22, on first looking into Chapman's Homer. You probably know the poem. Keats is describing his first experience of reading Homer's Odyssey and Iliad in the Elizabethan translation by George Chapman. There was Keats didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge and couldn't read Greek, so he relied upon a translation. But he's reading an old translation by one of Shakespeare's contemporaries. There was a growing enthusiasm in the period for recovering the writings of Shakespeare's contemporaries, led by Charles Lamb, whose dramatic specimens were published in 1808, and of course by the lectures of Coleridge and Hazlitt. And this is the poem, talking about the experience of reading Homer finally in this translation. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. So Keats's poem is a sewn-like mixture, blending Gothic images, the Western bards, with classical, the Greek god of poetry, Apollo. Comparing the act of reading with stargazing and with global exploration, it ranges daringly across space and time. Even the historical mistake it makes at the end is in this associative spirit. He conflates the moment when Balboa first sighted the Pacific with the moment when Cortez first glimpsed the Valley of Mexico. Okay, if we go on to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. And actually the one after that. What is remarkable and romantic about this poem, I think, is the way in which it turns the experience of reading a translation into a meditation on the translatability of experience, presenting the reading of an English version of Homer, the discovery of Uranus by Herschel, which is the new planet, and the exploration of the new world of Central and South America, as if they were, in effect, translations of one another. Strikingly, the poem makes the assumption that investigating the past is the same as gazing out into the future. It talks as if mental and physical traveling, the practice of art, and the practice of science are all essentially the same activity. The wild surmise at the end is in fact nothing but an exemplification of Wordsworth's earlier dictum that poetry is the impassioned expression which is in the countenance of all science. That is the message of the poem, but the miracle of it, it seems to me, is that it does not merely assert the value of the associative imagination, but it also embodies it by contriving to be brimful of little internal rhymes that bind its far-flung ideas together so that its final effect is of a subtle inner unity. Look at the way in which the phrase realms of gold rhymes in both sound and sense with goodly kingdoms, and how the Western Islands at the beginning look forward to the westward-facing peak in Darien at the end, how Apollo, the sun god, looks forward to Uranus, the new planet, and how the wide expanse of the deep-browed Homer looks forward to the watcher's ken. Ken is an Old English word meaning both purview, your perspective as it were, but also your knowledge. It's from kind of Kunde, German for knowledge. But it's a wonderful word to use in that context because an astronomer's ken is, of course, what he can see. The boldness of Chapman, daring to scale Homer, is implicitly compared to the stoutness of Cortes on his great American adventure. Notice also how the pure serene, the calm and healthy air of Chapman's Homer looks forward to the first sight of the Pacific, the great still ocean, which is quite appropriately received by Cortes's men in a state of sublime silence. And how nicely our view of the sea has been prepared for by that swimming planet earlier on. It's as if all of these different elements of the poem kind of know about one another, and they rhyme and modify and move into one another. So, for the Romantics, the past is the future, and the future is also the past. If we could have the next slide, please. To give another example from a different genre, here is a very popular canvas from 1821, it's just 4 years after Keats's sonnet. It's a depiction of Belshazzar's feast by the apocalyptic painter John Martin, a painstaking reconstruction of ancient Babylon, but one that commemorates the announcement of its imminent destruction, the moment when the writing on the wall is there in sort of bright lights on the left, the moment when the writing on the wall appeared before Belshazzar and his court to prophesy the fall of the kingdom. The story is from the book of Daniel, of course. Earnest as Martin's work of historical excavation was, he has rebuilt the Tower of Babel here in the background and the Hanging Gardens, as well as the Temple of Belus, in accordance with the latest archaeological research. He did a lot of homework on this. So earnest as this effort of sort of reconstruction is, to many of his contemporaries, the final effect of the painting was strangely contemporary, eerily reminiscent of modern London. If you could show the next slide. So you can see how actually in his critique of ancient luxury, as it were, lots of people saw a critique of Regency London, which had, of course, been transformed by a lot of new and very expensive building projects, notably Regent Street and here the Burlington Arcade in Piccadilly. And interestingly, a lot of people at the time, because they saw the improvements in London as being rather fraudulent, they were often stone facades masquerading mere brick, which is what Regent Street is. They called it the modern Babylon. They saw it as being a very unstable construction. Even before the high point of the British Empire has been reached, then, the Romantics are already envisioning its demise. Such was the new sense of history as ruin that came out of the 18th century. And if we could see the next slide, there's a similar idea lurking at the heart of Joseph Michael Gandy's painting from later in the same decade, the 1820s, of John Soane's newly refurbished Bank of England as a ruin. So Soane has as it were, refurbed the Bank of England, and then he commissioned Gandhi to paint a picture of it as a ruin. At first glance, of course, this bird's eye view is nothing but a glorified real estate flyer, a piece of shameless self-advertisement on the part of the architect. But it also has a very real interest, a preoccupation even with ruin, with the ruin of the Bank of England as an allegory of British economic instability, but also in a more literal sense as a meditation on the inevitability of material decay. One day, Soane says, my bank will be a ruin too. The upside of this is that it is going to make an impressive spectacle. He's very proud of what a grand ruin it'll be. But the downside is that the future may never know what this building was. Contemporary reviews commenting on Soane's refurbishments remarked that it looked more like a mausoleum than a bank. Right from its inception then, this was a building that seemed to realize that ruin was its final destiny, its ultimate meaning. And that, I would argue, is what makes it romantic. In the 18th century, the classical was understood classically as a kind of timeless standard in culture and architecture. In the Romantic period, however, everything, including neoclassical style, like Soane's bank, became relativized, historicized, subject to temporal irony. In true post-revolutionary spirit, resurrections, recoveries of lost promise are what the Romantics most deeply long for, but it is also what they fear. After the French Revolutionary Terror of 1794, all utopian imaginings leave them almost equally excited and appalled. One of the most archetypal English Romantic poems, maybe we could have the next slide. One of the most archetypal English Romantic poems is Coleridge's unfinished lyrical romance, Kubla Khan, written in 1798 but not published until 1816. Like Keats's Homer sonnet, Coleridge's poem ranges widely over space and time, taking in Renaissance accounts of the great Khan's empire, but also Bartram's travels in America and James Bruce's expeditions to discover the source of the Nile. Having taken an anodyne, opium, for a slight indisposition, he was poorly, Coleridge tells us in the preface, he fell asleep with the medieval travel book, Purchas's Pilgrimage, on his chest, and dreamt a long poem in imagery about Kubla Khan. But when he awoke and began to transcribe it, he was fatally distracted by a man from a nearby village who had come to his cottage to harangue him about the rent. And what he's laying before us in this final published version of the poem is all that he managed to write down of his vision before it dried up. So, Coleridge's poem is not merely about the ruination of a historical paradise, Kubla's long-gone pleasure dome. It's a ruin in itself, notwithstanding the fact that it actually gives an impression of utter completeness, of having reached its destination. One of the strange things about Kubla Khan is it really does feel like it's finished. Okay, the lyric begins with a description of the construction of the Khan's pleasure dome in a way that recalls the revolutionary attempts to rebuild Eden on the Champ de Mars during the First Fédération of 1790. And as in that case, no sooner was the garden completed than voices were heard in the midst of it prophesying war. If we could have the next slide, please. The poem's romanticism lies in its free form. It progresses like the sacred river Alf itself, moving in and out of different landscapes, now above ground, now below. Opposites blend in the poem, as in the river, the stately dome of pleasure, the mighty gushing fountain, the underground caves of ice. Okay, next slide, please. And then, in a sudden temporal and tonal break, the final section tells of the poet's conditional ambition to revive Kubla's long-gone pleasure garden through song. This ambition is kindled by the memory of a vision of an Abyssinian maid singing of Mount Abora. This was Mount Amara in the first version, one of the putative sites of Eden and one of the hidden topographical sources for the poem, so in Egypt. If I could revive within me her symphony and song, the poet says, I would rebuild that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice. But the question that the poem leaves us with is not so much about the viability of this assertion, whether the poet could, through pure poetry, achieve this feat of historical reconstruction. Arguably, he's already done it, or begun to do it, in the lines we are reading. But rather, the question is, what would his audience make of it? What kind of reception would he get? Could I revive within me her symphony and song to such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long, I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. Okay, so why are these famous lines so magical? They're magical, I would suggest, for many reasons, not least because of their irregular structure. The resurrection of the distant rhyming word ice in thrice and then again in paradise is very effective. It's a striking flourish, an unexpected turn, like the eruption of a fountain of water from an underground cave. Kubla Khan is a powerful poem, but it is also showy, tendentious. It relies too much on cheap special effects. Coleridge was probably aware of this. Indeed, it might explain why for a long time he chose not to publish it. Deep down, he, like Wordsworth, thought poetry should be conscientious, philosophical, sustained. It should engage earnestly with the problems of contemporary society. But Kubla Khan is completely fantastical, irresponsible, inspiring but also disorientating. Its images are too heterogeneous, its ambition too flagrantly, too lazily utopian. That might be why Coleridge paints such an ambivalent picture of the poet at the end. He sees him as a powerful figure who dares to dream impossible dreams, blends experiences from different places and times, harmonizes sunny pleasure domes and caves of ice. But he also sees him as a dangerous one, like a revolutionary terrorist, because of the untethered, floating nature of his utopian imaginings. There's a possibility that the idea behind this scary poet figure is one of the assassins who's been, as it were, given a glimpse of paradise by the old man of the mountain, and they've been let out, and they will do anything to recover this dream vision. So he's kind of invoking kind of Islamic assassins in this figure of the poet. Coleridge, as befits a radical who later became a conservative, is on both sides of the question here. On the one hand, he sides with the poet dreamers who dream the dreams of their generation, but on the other, he is an incipient reactionary who wants the poet figure cordoned off, placed in a separate realm, a realm of entertainment where he can't have a dangerous influence upon others. This ambivalence is characteristic of many of the Romantics. It was they who invented the idea that art could save the world, redeem the revolution, but they were also the ones who theorized the notion of art as a separate sacred realm, inviolable, but also in a strange new way, remote. They were, like Victor Frankenstein, both fascinated and fearful of their creation. So, what do the Romantic poets have to offer us today? Briefly, because of course I really have only had time for a very brief, sketchy answer to this question, I would say that what the Romantics have to offer us is the first great apprehension of modernity in all its beauty and terror. What is more, this apprehension is all the more vivid and open and complete in them because it was the first and because they experienced it so fully. Romanticism hit different nations at different times. In France, arguably, it doesn't take hold until the mid-19th century, with Hugo, Stendhal, and Baudelaire. But in England and Scotland, it strikes in the 1790s, which is at that moment when the shock of the twin revolutions, the French and the industrial, really begins to be felt. Traditional period boundaries don't make a lot of sense when charting this phenomenon, however. Most often, novelists like the Brontes are described as Victorians on English university courses. And indeed, in certain respects, this label makes sense. But at bottom, I think they are also romantics, following through in fiction the implications of what their predecessors, Wordsworth and Byron, had laid out in verse. Perhaps the last great English romantic writer, in the terms that I've laid out here at least, was Charles Darwin. For in Darwin, as in Coleridge or Soane, we find the same sense of history as ruin, of history providing a patchy, heterogeneous record that might just contain a sublime, hidden unity. We also have the same interest in the beauty of analogies, in phenomena that are translations of one another. When in the Biographia Literaria, Coleridge compared the stop-start actions of a water insect trying to swim upstream to the struggles of a mind trying to remember a name, he was holding out the hope that the former was not simply a metaphor for the latter, but the same process manifesting itself differently. Darwin brought a new precision to thinking of this kind, and in the fullness of time helped show us not only its beauty, but also its truth. Darwin is an anti-utopian writer, of course. In his vision of nature, there never was and never can be any Eden. War is always prophesied in his Xanadu. But while his underlying principles are unquestionably Malthusian and require a continuous struggle at the heart of things, his overall perspective is far from Philistine. He is no narrow-minded utilitarian, no 18th century taxonomist. For what is endlessly accommodated in his view of nature is constant interaction and collaboration, endless proliferation and variation, a dynamic universe of niche and nuance. And if we could have the final slide, please. This is the final paragraph of The Origin of Species. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. These laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction, inheritance, which is almost implied by reproduction, variability from the indirect and direct action of the external conditions of life and from use and disuse, a ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Okay, I actually put 1859 next to that quotation, but that's wrong. The 1859 version was slightly different. The picture is one of infinite beauty as well as sublime terror. That's my main point. And in the original version of this paragraph, in the actual 1859 version, Darwin wrote, originally breathed into a few forms or into one. Only in the second edition of 1860 did he amend it to originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. But even this equivocation, this uncertainty is, it seems to me, highly romantic, an open-ended double vision. And that's all I've got for you, I'm afraid. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I enjoyed the lecture very much. And I have some things to ask. But first of all, I'm going to pass on to Danielle, who will give his thoughts on your talk.
You can begin, John. Yes, you can begin.
No, you talk. I just have a question or two.
Well, there are many things I would like to that inspired me to in your talk. Trying to think where to begin, but I find it very interesting how you link Romanticism with modernity by these aspects of talking about the past, point out to the future, and future is ruin. So the sense of everything will decay. That's would you say that there's a kind of sense of the things are pre-established for that? Or like I was thinking maybe. I mean, I think pre-establishment, but in Hegel's sense of the end of art, for instance, because of course he shares the same environment, atmosphere of the Romantics. Germany, and it's very similar to what you illustrated in England. But this is one thing. But please, you can. So if things are in a way pre-established, or that everything will turn out into ruin. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you make the right point to in a way suggest that German Romanticism might be a bit different. That from Hegel through to Marx, if we think of Marx as a romantic thinker, then there is a utopian element that continues in German romantic thought. Which is not so clearly present in English. I mean, Shelley is our great utopian, but I think that the English Romanticism is obviously less philosophical in certain respects. I mean, it's Coleridge rather than a conservative, rather than Hegel, even though he's influenced by Kant. But I suppose what afflicts the English Romantics most, I think, is this very worldly sense of the ravages of history, and that's not just the failure of the revolution. It's also, I think, just to do with the fact that they are learning more and more about past cultures, so that the more they learn about ancient Egypt and the Elgin marbles, the more that these the notion of I suppose one way of thinking about it would be that Pope and Dryden have a notion of the classical which is sort of timeless and which is untroubled by a kind of archaeological knowledge of, the 7 layers of Troy or whatever. Whereas I think the more that the Romantics begin to understand about just how much time has passed, just what has been lost, that inevitably produces a kind of a world sorrow, if you like, and a sense of the absolute fragility of things. I think, Dryden and Pope in the early 18th century had a kind of, along with a lot of Renaissance thinkers across Europe, had a great confidence about, late Renaissance culture, that it was really going to last. Whereas I think the Romantics knew that what they were producing was, written in water, but that was the way of things, as it were. But I think there's also the sort of the worldliness of English Romanticism does distinguish it perhaps from the German variety, let's say, which is much more pure in many respects. Does that answer the question?
Yes, and connected with this, because in your presentation of Romanticism, so we can extend the period far beyond 1832, which is interesting. And I was thinking, it occurred to me while you were talking, a passage from Machado de Assis in late 19th century, I think 1893 or 4, and a piece that he wrote in a newspaper, a chronicle, and he's commenting the celebrations of the anniversary of Shakespeare in England, and he says, one day, I'm like quoting from my head, like one day when there will be no British Empire, there will be Shakespeare. When there will be when people no longer speak English, they will speak Shakespeare. And and it's interesting that, of course, all the every major Romantic writer spoke about Shakespeare, and they saw Shakespeare to an extent as a contemporary. So to an extent as something everlasting. So this idea is very much present in Hazlitt and Coleridge. This infinity of Shakespeare. So this appears in this passage that I quote from Machado de Assis. Some things maybe can last. In the case of Hazlitt, I would say very much about Shakespeare, or Titian, the Italian painter. I think he had very few models that he could say that this one will last even if all the culture that we know disappears. I don't know.
Well, I mean, Shakespeare's certainly the hope. That's the thing that they pin their hopes on. Because that's why he becomes so crucial to ideas about art, about posterity, and about art as a high realm of achievement and of humanity. But I think what goes along with that experience for the Romantic writers is, that growing sense they have of looking at all Shakespeare's contemporaries who've been pretty much forgotten, and they're slowly unearthing them from under the rocks and discovering they're really quite good. But they're gone. They were dead as doornails. Chapman, Webster. And so it's that double sense of, the excitement of recovery, but also of the way in which time plows things under, and the ways in which these retrievals may not always take place, the ways in which things are being buried all the time, is a very powerful sense with them, I think.
I have just one more question, then I'll pass on to John. Again, thinking of the core of your presentation with the idea of finity, of things that eventually will turn into ruin. Yes. How can you make any connection this with the forms of writing, for example, or even the media? Think of the periodical press and now the boom that happened in literary magazines. As if the writings were not made to last because they were published in a perishable media form. And not only in the case of the periodical essays, but again, novels and poetry were also firstly published in this format.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think that's a very good. I mean, the two separate strands to that. I mean, one would be to say, and it's true in German Romanticism too, that the fragment becomes a deliberate kind of genre of itself. And probably the best example of that in English Romantic writing is Coleridge, who is, that he's flaunting the fragmentary nature of some of his poetry, in particular. Christabel, he publishes in 1816 Christabel, Kubla Khan and the Pains of Sleep. They're two unfinished poems. And to his friends as well as to him, they're almost more expressive because they're unfinished. That sense of what they might have been, that sense of their expressive openness, that expressive their sort of their formal adventurousness being captured in their status as ruin. They become more poignant, but they also become oddly more ambitious. What would they have been once they were completed? So there's definitely a cultivation of the aesthetic of the fragment in Romantic poetry. But I think you're right that it is also in a way connected at least to the periodical aesthetic, in the sense that what a lot of writers end up writing periodical essays, periodical prose, and it's a second best, it's a third best option for them. They would prefer to be writing poetry or doing something else. But they end up finding this new form, which is a very exciting form, and yet they're not quite sure what to make of it. Is it just kind of waste paper? Or is the essay form actually a new genre, very exciting and adventurous genre that can cultivate can capture something of the fugitive? I mean, the best Romantic essays seem to be aware of their fugitiveness and are better able to capture, as it were, the everyday, the fleeting nature of things because of their form. Lamb's essays, particularly, in some of Hazlitt's. So I think that they, almost accidentally came into a sort of an aesthetic, if you like, of the fugitive and of the imperfect through the magazine boom.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So, John, you said you have some questions to put forward.
No, we have a couple of questions coming in. Tiago has a question. I'm just going to ask you to some reflections or imagine. What would, I put my question on the chat, but what would the Romantics have thought of our world today?
Well,
just throw anything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that that's, of course, a mind-blowing question. I mean, I think they would have been ready for it to a surprising degree. I mean, that Mary Shelley's The Last Man is a long and, not very good, but still very thoughtful and interesting novel about a plague that sort of decimates Europe. So she's already doing pandemic thinking, and and I think one of the things. I mean, your question has so many ramifications. I'm focusing on COVID, which is just one thing. But I mean, one of the key things that maybe starts this particular romantic clock ticking is Malthus, the essay on population. And of course, the Romantics all hate Malthus to bits because he basically gets rid of the idea that there can never be a perfect society because it will always overpopulate itself. That nature will always be one of struggle and tribulation. And I think that descended deep into the Romantic psyche. And Darwin sort of half redeemed it by giving a more positive version of Malthusian nature, which is full of beauty and variety. But he couldn't get rid of Malthus. That's still the same pressure on population. And I think that, that Malthus is just one example, I think, which, I'm not sure how Hegel deals with Malthus, but that Malthus was a real shock to the English thought system, if you like, because of the way he introduced or forced people to think about the endless pressure on life, really. And of course, it's one of the things that fuels empire among the British. But it, and gives us all kinds of imperial fantasies, but also horrors. But it's also, that they are thinking about pandemics, about epidemics, about things going wrong, about Britain very soon not being able to feed itself, this small island with a limited agricultural resource and so on. So I think they would have been ready, actually, to a surprising degree. I'm not sure whether they would have been ready for the technology, but they would have been ready for. I mean, they were already writing science fiction, I suppose.
John, I think your microphone is not on.
We could go on for hours and hours about this, but I'm going to bring in Tiago now. Tiago, would you like to make...
Tiago wrote his question. Do you want me to read it?
No, I think he's coming in now.
Okay.
Okay, I may make it. Well, I'd like to ask you, Professor Dart, to comment on how this perception of irredeemably lost past structures or informs the writings of so-called Scottish romantics, such as Walter Scott's, in which this sort of nostalgia for a superseded pre-modernity had and probably still has a very palpable political resonance. Thank you.
That's very interesting. Well, I mean, I think it's just, it's there in Boswell and Johnson's travels in the mid 18th century, where they go from, because I think the contrast when you went to Scotland was greater than anywhere across Europe, because you would go to Edinburgh and you'd see a great centre of enlightenment. You'd see the city of Hume and the moral philosophers, an elegant city and a city of great sort of cultivation. But you wouldn't have to go far from Edinburgh or Glasgow to discover, people walking around with bare feet, living in, cottages, living very much as they would have done 200, 300 years before. And I think that was a very rich place for Scottish writers to contemplate modernity, because it's just not as layered as the English experience. It was a great juxtaposition of opposites. But I think what that meant is that the Scottish soul was divided from the beginning between a kind of rational, progressive, commercial-minded perspective and a romantic, more autochthonous, if you like, a more, sort of deeply embedded relationship to the land, to the people, to the past, to Scottish ways, as it were. And Waverley is the classic example, isn't it, where, Scott's first Waverley novel, where he has his hero deep down knows that he has to embrace, the Hanoverian compromise, modernity, which means England and the Union. But his heart is with, Flora MacIver and, the song and the bagpipes on the mountainside. And I suppose Romanticism in Scott becomes a question of how is it that can you have your cake and eat it? What do you do with that sense of the past? Because what people often say about the Romantics is, they often had this longing for the past. Scott was deeply pragmatic about those things. He didn't want to go back to, as it were, Highland life. But at the same time, he recognized that in Highland life, there was a core, a human core, that should not be lost in modernity. That modernity risked being incredibly soulless and utilitarian, as it were. And so that it became a symbol for him of what one had to preserve. So that balancing act and how you balance that artistically becomes, the task, the struggle. And I suppose with Scott, as with lots of, romantic writers, it's about trying to balance that pull in different directions, really.
Okay, thank you very much. Tiago, do you want to come back?
No, thank you very much.
Okay, I have a number of questions.
Yeah, there are a few questions on YouTube too. You want to read them?
I have them right in front of me. Cassio Greco, Romanticism is recognized as a wellspring of modern-day environmental thought. In this sense, do you reckon Romanticism invented a new language and set of descriptions to depict this aspect?
I think that's a very good question, and without being an expert on this at all, I would say kind of yes and no. It would be nice to argue that the Romantics were the first. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, sure.
It would be nice to argue that the Romantics were the first ecologists, but it's probably true only in a kind of limited sense. I think, in the sense that I think certainly after Malthus, and probably because of our island experience, people are beginning earlier here than elsewhere to realise that nature is not limitless. And so there is a sort of sense in Wordsworth's sense of the lakes is already very ecological. And very much in terms of kind of preservation of an environment. The fact that Britain was industrialized or began to be industrialized before anywhere else in a way led to that an apprehension of the ecological threat, as it were. But I think if you look through Romantic literature as a modern day, as a 21st century reader, you'd be disappointed by there not being more of that, if you like. You'd be disappointed by the extent to which people still talk about nature as if it's a static home that is a place that you can always go back to, that is essentially unchanging, that will always be there for you. A kind of pastoral vision, if you like. It's like, I suppose one of the things that Darwin does is, in a way, is he tries to inspire us all with a different kind of love of nature, but it's one in which nature is not pastoral. But I think, that there's a lot of Romantic poetry. Even, Wordsworth has a highly developed ecological sense in some way. He realizes when nature's threatened, that aspect is not. That aspect is not uppermost in his writing always. That older views of nature still survive.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here from ASW. It's central. In German Romanticism, the idea of fragment is central. In what sense ruin is ruin already at the birth of the poem, of the building? Is that I think it's more of a comment. German Romanticism, the idea of fragment, ruin. In what sense is ruin, which you exemplified, also a fragment? ASW thinks that Kubla Khan would be a good example of this. The idea of ruin at the center of Kubla Khan.
Yes, well, I kind of agree. You know, it's a poem about a ruin, or at least a lost pleasure dome that needs to be rebuilt. But it is also, the poem itself is a ruin. What's strange, of course, is that if you read the poem without introduction, without the preface, you might not know. You know, that quite often in anthologies, it's simply published as a poem, Kubla Khan, which ends in that dramatic way. But when Coleridge published it first, of course, it had the preface, which apologized for the fact that this was all that was left of the great dream that he had. So he it was who insisted that, as it were, it was a ruin of a great utopian dream, of a powerful ambition, which was very like him, because he was forever promising to do wonderful things and being unable to complete them. But I think what's strange about the Romantics is, you know, that they clearly think ruins are groovy, that there's something enormously exciting about the double effect they have upon us, and that, you know, it's a you know, I'm sure you know, those of you that have been to England will know that there are lots of ruined churches in England because of the Reformation. You know, and Tintern Abbey is about one such church, so that it's tempting when one views these ruins. Often they're abbeys, monasteries and abbeys out in the countryside. It's very tempting when one views these ruins to see them as the ruins of time, as it were, like the pyramids or like Stonehenge. But of course, they're deeply political. You know, that people stole bricks to build nearby villages. It didn't. In some ways, it's a very prosaic process, the way in which these you know, abbeys and monasteries were pillaged. But nevertheless, I think it's in this period, in the Romantic period, that people start, as with Tintern Abbey, to contemplate these ruins with a new kind of apprehension of time, the time that must have wrecked this building, what it would mean to rebuild it. The whole idea, I suppose, is, you know, behind William Blake's Jerusalem, which is still kind of almost a national anthem here, is the idea of England needing to be rebuilt. It was once, as it were, a sanctified place, a place that was supposed to, you know, where Jesus is supposed to have trod, but it's a ruin and needs rebuilding. So I think perhaps what's romantic is the energy you get from the contemplation of ruins. And some of that is to do with just, it's the beginning of a rebuilding project. And the other is just that you get an enormous sense of the poignancy and power of ruins, of the enormity of time. And they often fetishize that, even with ruins that are not that old.
Yeah. Photography was just coming into being in the mid-19th century, and one of the major subjects of early photography was exactly this, ruins. I have other questions here. Come in.
Just to comment on that, I was thinking, so especially in the last part that you said, Greg, about the modernization of the city, so all the projects that were happening around the time, and you even showed some slides specifically on that. So how much this the sense of the past and the ruin influence the style that we would know now as being in the birth of modernity, and in contrast, or with, I don't know, like with similar transformations that took place in Paris few decades later, because you know, in Paris it seems to me the transformations were more drastic.
Yeah.
They expanded the roads and rebuilt everything. This was taking place in London too. We know a few decades earlier. But so if you could compare, and if you could say that there was also this element of looking at the past and the ruin and the rebuild of Paris, or no, this is specific about English modernity.
No, I know that's why I wanted to ask you about Brazil, actually, in the end. But I think it's a good question, because, you could, these things happen. If you just think of Romanticism as being a kind of modernism, as it were, it's the first access of a kind of modern conception. And it's interesting, I think, that the modernists, at least in England, were so dismissive of the Romantics, because I think I think what they didn't want to acknowledge is how much they shared, really, and how much they were indebted to the Romantics. But that is another story. But certainly, what's definitely the case, and what is fascinating for literary scholars is, okay, so if Romanticism is just a kind of modernity, and it's happening in different places at different times over the course of the 19th century, let's say, then it still matters that it happens differently in different places, in very specific ways. And France, it seems, and Paris seems to me to be, a very good case, because I think a lot of the same traits, the same shocks are being experienced, but they do manifest themselves. In a way, they happen in an even more schematic, as it were, and dramatic way in France and in Paris, because of the things you've talked about. I mean, I think the Haussmannization of Paris was dramatic and took place over a period of years. So it's not a slow redevelopment of London that was taking place over 20, 30 years. It's 2 years. And, so a poem like, Baudelaire's Le Cygne, the Swan, in the Les Fleurs du Mal, is all about, walking among the building site, really, that was the Place du Carrousel, I think, and seeing this sort of swan with its plumage kind of besmirched by the dust of modernity. And he starts thinking in classical terms about the great, long lost exiles, homeless figures, Andromache. And of course, what's very French about it is it's all happened very quickly. It's very dramatic. It's literally a building site. And also that he goes straight back to the classical, in some sense. Even though it's a romantic poem, in some ways it's about a classic, the disturbance is understood in classical terms. And it's not as free form as, that's the strange thing as well about Baudelaire. He was quite free form in his prose, in the, Spleen de Paris, but the poetry is still very classical in a way, in its form. But still, you can see all of the same traits, the same grief is being expressed, possibly in even a kind of more heightened way, I think, because I think the shock was all the more acute. That where, if you like, the failure of the revolution, as it were, occurs, it dawns on the English over a period of about 10 or 20 years. For the French, it happened in 3. From 1848 to 1851, or the accession of Napoleon III. I think it's an extreme trauma, and the art that comes out of it is expressed in a quite a dramatic way. But one of the questions I would have for you guys would be, if it's true that Romanticism is just a kind of modernity that comes out of a sense of a heterogeneous past that comes from different places, and an ever-changing nature, something remote about the past, then what does that mean for a new nation like Brazil in the early 19th century? Does that mean that you're born into Romanticism, that Brazil is a romantic nation from the beginning, because all of those traits are there? In other words, I'm talking about something that was quite unusual for the English, but in fact, it's what it means to be Brazilian.
If we take, for example, one of the most important critical work on Brazilian literature ever written, Antônio Cândido's The Making of Brazilian Literature. He begins with Romanticism, isn't it, John? The starting point is Romanticism, because, well, Brazil as a nation only truly began in 1822, when it got its independence from Portugal. that was quite late if you compare to other Latin American countries. So yeah, to a great extent, and that's you can correct me if I'm wrong, John or Thiago. For Antonio Cândido, Brazilian literature per se is something that can only be that only started in the Romantic period. And in the case of Brazilian literature, scholars and writers would look back to the indigenous time, for example. So there's especially in Zé de Alencar, but not only him. So the past of Brazil, although it was not like Brazil, but if you could link to the past, you would go to the indigenous cultures. And they would translate that into a kind of literary work, and this the language, all the even like archaeological work, ethnological work, to compilate this vocabulary, and this is to the 20th century. If you take the Modernist movement in 1920s, it was pretty much still on this track. Thiago? Thiago is more specialist in this than me.
One can say that.
I think we better have could everybody who's not speaking turn off the microphones? Please, we have too many microphones on.
I think that Romanticism is the official ideology, actually, of the early Brazilian Empire, as many of the prominent Romantic writers, such as the one that Daniel has just mentioned, José de Alencar, Gonçalves Dias and Gonçalves Guimarães, they were all co-opted to the institutions around the emperor and were given places of titles of honor, and they were part of the historical institute as a way of tracing back the origins of this sort of Brazilian empire, and as a sort of instrument for creating a sort of legitimacy that this new nation perceived as lacking to its institutions. So I think that that this role of scrutinizing or articulating a sort of critique to modernity, when it is and try to bridge by trying to recover sort of lost or superseded past. In Brazil, it works in a different manner as a way of donating or investing with legitimacy a polity that sees its own standing towards other countries and towards its own people as rather shaky, I guess. So Romanticism is rather reaction. It plays a very conservative role here, and it is very associated to the imperial institutions of the 19th century.
And of course, the big debate has always been, to what an extent should Brazil be linked, depend on European, traditionally French culture, today North American. You can see this all the time, the debates about the Amazon. The government defends its Amazon as being Brazilian. We can do whatever we want with the Amazon. We can chop down all the trees. Foreigners shouldn't come in and tell us what to do. This is the position of the government at the moment. So these debates continue. To what an extent should Brazil be very dependent, or how should it handle the traditional links to Europe, particularly France? And of course, the big turning point, as was mentioned, was modernism, 1922. The Modernist Movement looked towards Brazilian roots. You can see this in the composer Villa-Lobos, I'm sure you know. Can we go on to a couple more questions?
Yes, we still have more questions on that.
We have one question which follows on from the remark you made about the modernists not realizing they were indebted to the Romantics. This is from Patricia Didoni. is this sense of sorrow from the Romantics in any way similar to what is portrayed by T.S. Eliot?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Yes, I think so. And I think the relation of people like Eliot in particular, and maybe less so sort of Pound and Joyce, and although also Woolf, I think. I think that they were, their sensibility was very romantic in many ways. And I think, the way that, the love song of Alfred Prufrock and The Wasteland and even the Four Quartets work, the way in which Eliot uses the fragment, as it were, and reads past poetry and builds his poetry out of past poetry with that sense of indebtedness and belatedness, and that attempt to create a sort of hidden unity out of these fragments that are my ruins, I think is all deeply romantic, as it were. The Romantics would have, I think they would have still been astonished at the kind of formal invention and that clearly the poetry looks different and it's got an extraordinary kind of daring. The Wasteland would have shocked, Shelley and Coleridge to view, I think. But I think they would have been very sympathetic to its sensibility. I think they would have understood it completely.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I think that what's interesting, I think, is the way in which the modernists feel they have to distance themselves from the Romantics. That what they've inherited, I suppose, they've all grown up with a Victorian culture which has consecrated these people. So, Shelley and Keats and Charles Lamb and Wordsworth have all become like saints, to Victorian culture. They've been embodied and monumentalized. And so the modernists feel they have to break down those statues in order to say anything. Their real enemies, though, is Victorian and Edwardian culture rather than Romantic culture, I think, because Romantic culture was itself very iconoclastic. And so quite often their critique of the Romantics is hollow, I think, because I think they're kicking them in order to make space for themselves, when in fact, the sensibility is quite similar, I think.
We have a question from our expert on Cervantes, who I think is Silvia Cobello. I'm pretty sure it's Silvia Cobello. She would like to know the persistence of the reading, the Romantic interpretation, such as that of Don Quixote. How can that be seen nowadays? And she mentioned I think the Romantic approach, the Romantic interpretation of Don Quixote, which I think is being questioned. She mentions the critic who talks about the Romantic approach to Quixote, Anthony Close. Would you have anything to say on that?
Well, I haven't thought about that, although it's very interesting because, the writer I'm editing at the moment, Charles Lamb, clearly read Cervantes in English 17th century translation, must be said, but and he was very important to him. And, Lamb is a comic writer and understands, I think, better than most what's great about Cervantes. And references are sprinkled through his works. The same is true of Coleridge, Wordsworth. What's difficult about it, I suppose, it's a really great influence study, I think, to do, because there's a lot of bits and pieces, and there are also, as it were, kind of larger figures where, Wordsworth himself is described as a Quixote, these sort of wandering idealists who refuse to give up on an idea. So there's, that book remains very important in the period. What doesn't happen, I suppose, is somebody really doing an imitation of it or a parody of it or a sequel to it. So, the book would be, Sterne's Tristram Shandy, which they all read. That would be the closest thing in the period to somebody really trying to do something that was a bit like Cervantes in English. And all the Romantics kind of grow up on that book and love it. But none of them are able to do anything in quite the same vein. The essays of Elia, the essays that I'm editing at the moment, have got a sort of kind of quixotic humour, I suppose, and Lamb definitely likes Cervantes. But I can't really. I mean, the way they write about it is they think it's the first novel. That they think it's the thing from which everything else came.
Yeah. I was invited in 2016, which is the anniversary of the deaths of Cervantes and Shakespeare. I was invited to take part in a debate at the Faculty of Law with a Cervantes scholar. We had to put forwards who was the greatest. For some reason, that was cancelled. I'm never been quite sure why it was cancelled. If it was a bit too much like a fight or something. I'm sure there must have been others in the debate. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, one of Hazlitt's greatest regret is to never have read Cervantes in the original. He says that, and he begins his lecture on the English novelists with Cervantes. So before entering into the major 18th century British novelists, he spends a few pages describing and giving the sentiments of Cervantes.
Yeah,
and it's not the only Spanish novel they like either, is it? I mean, both Hazlitt and Lamb like. Is it Gil Blas? They also like. That's for example. I wish I could remember the name, but they quite like. It's always in translation, but they quite like the other picaresque comic novels of 17th century that they enjoy.
Both of them were translated by Smollett, weren't they? Both of them were translated by Smollett, by Tobias Smollett, weren't they?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. No, that's right.
Do we have more questions here in the chat?
We'll be closing in a couple of minutes. If anybody would like to put a further question, or if there's any question I've missed, please put it on chat right now. So, Solange, okay? Any comments?
Oh, no, John. No comments. Okay. It was a great lecture.
Yeah. Okay, Daniel.
Guzman Dafaranch. Does that? That's one that Lamb is very keen on. Well,
and also, I think Tiago will know this better. Laredo de Tormes. What was it called again?
Lazarillo de Tormes.
Lazarillo de Tormes. I know that he's mentioned more than once by Hazlitt and I believe by Lamb too. I think they were really into the picaresque novel, maybe as a form of this past that has been lost, or only the fragments survived. Maybe something in that.
Well, they were read and translated and adapted widely across Europe. German, Dutch, French.
They all know the Charlotte Lennox novel, the comic novel, The Female Quixote, which is about the young 18th century girl who uses it as her manual. So she goes to every party in Bath and every outing in London and as it were, acts entirely as Quixote would have ordered. They know.
This novel is being translated here in Brazil.
Did you translate it? No.
No, Julieta.
Oh, how is Julieta?
Yes, Julieta Widman.
Yeah, I think so. I remember vaguely recalling it. Yeah.
But there's an argument, of course, that he's the first romantic in a way, Quixote, that's directly trying to keep romance alive after it's dead. But that sort of sense of the past, I suppose he's in denial, isn't he? But that sort of investment in the past that makes you deeply belated. He's the first figure of that kind in world literature, really, in a way. And I suppose that must be one of the reasons why they feel an affinity with him, because independently of the book itself, the idea is so powerful.
Okay, I think we're fine. I don't see any more questions.
Do you have time for a last question?
Yeah, fine, go on. Yeah.
I guess in continental Europe and in Latin America, there's a sort of clear relationship between Romanticism and nationalism. as nationalism is a sort of political ideology geared towards bridging the gap between the past and the present. And how does English Romanticism is streamlined into English nationalism? Because this relationship is not much often talked about, the relationship between the English Romantics and English nationalism.
Can I just, sorry, of course, there is an excellent book on this that Dart knows very well. I think Dickens' Romantic Englishness. Of course, it is a topic, but sorry.
No, well, I mean, yeah, you're right. That's the book you should read. But I mean, I'm trying to answer my own. I think what's interesting, and this is again one of the ways in which it happens in different places in different times. I think that in lots of nations, Italy, for example, Romanticism has to be a kind of nationalism, in the 19th century. It's all about trying to get independence for Italy. And it's about returning, getting your country back from the different kings and princes that squat over it, recovering Italian culture. And its connection to a certain kind of politics is unavoidable. In England, it is different. It's just that it can, Romanticism as a set of traits, as it were, can work, it can work very differently. And I suppose in Scotland, for example, Scottish Romanticism is very much, as we've said before, about Scottish traits. But what it's also trying to do as a British school of thought, what the Blackwoods writers and Walter Scott are trying to do, is they are trying, as it were, like as Madame de Staël in a way prescribed, they're trying to say that the best kind of literature is rooted in the soil of a particular national experience and history. That's what good literature is, that it has to be national, it has to be related to your folk traditions, and so that brand of British nationalism, which is quite Scottish, as it were, is that brand of Romanticism is quite nationalistic and quite right wing, as it were. The thing is just that doesn't really. There's a lot of other Romantic writers in the period that it doesn't really explain. That the writers in London, Hazlitt and Keats and Shelley and Byron. Byron's really interested in national traditions when he's writing about Greece and Italy and supporting their cause for freedom. But he's not a nationalist in any straightforward sense, in an English sense. And I think he's not, in terms of his aesthetics, so I think that there are lots of the more radical or liberal. I mean, I suppose one way of thinking about Romanticism would be that it can be quite a liberal mode in England. And liberalism is, I suppose, always in the end related to a kind of nationalism and national republicanism. It's just not. It's not so rooted in the land, in the people, in native traditions, in authenticity. And I think it's not that the English we're such, wonderfully liberal people, or that we're this, it's not. I think there are reasons, as it were, that why Romanticism has such a broad face, why it's so various in England, and it's just to do with the historical circumstances. I think that it was experienced as a predicament, as I suppose I tried to say before, and that lots of people thought of different ways out of the predicament, and a kind of returning to national traditions, national folk traditions, wasn't the only solution from lots of people's perspectives, I suppose. Maybe also because there are many traditions. There are Welsh, Irish, Scottish, English, metropolitan, provincial. It broke up into lots of different techniques, I suppose. But it is a difference, I think. I mean, it's also probably true in France too. France is the other nation where Romanticism doesn't have a sort of liberal national character necessarily.
Well, thank you for a great answer and great explanation, Professor Dart.
I don't know whether it was, but thank you. Thanks for the question.
I don't know if you have much time left, John. So, and your microphone is off. So can you turn on, please?
Sorry, I was chattering away. Okay, no, I think we can close there. And I've learned a lot tonight about the Romantics. I think it's getting, I can just see the shadows are creeping in on Midsummer's Day. And it's getting, I haven't put the lights on, it's getting dark here in Sao Paulo, but we're 4 hours behind you. And weather's rather similar. Yesterday seemed a very English summer's day, 20 degrees. Cloud, a bit overcast, sun coming out from time to time. Seemed a typical English day yesterday. Today was a bit sunny and dry. And what's the weather like been like today in London?
Warm but cloudy.
Oh yeah, typical,
about 20 degrees, I think.
Yeah, 20 degrees is warm. Yeah. Okay.
Before you, I believe you're going to announce the next one, but
Yeah. I don't have my list here. What's the next one?
Do you have the list?
I think it's the woman in white.
Solange.
I think it's the one on nonfiction, right?
The nonfiction will
the
be
next one is about
August.
the woman in white.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
nonfiction will be August. Solange, would you like to say something about the woman in white?
Announce next one.
Wilkie Collins. On the last Thursday of next month in the evening, the next question will be about Wilkie Collins and the woman in white. This will be organized by Solange. Se quer falar alguma coisa rápido? Don't say anything.
Well, we are going to talk about Wilkie Collins and the permanence of Gothic elements in Victorian literature.
Okay. If people don't receive my mails regularly, just send a mail to me, jmilton@uspusp.br, to get information on events, particularly those connected to translation. I'd just like to thank Professor Gregory Dart once again. I've learned a lot today. Thank you very, very much. And hope it's possible to meet in person one day.
Yeah, well, that would be great. Well, you know where I am.
Okay, thank you very
You're
much.
very welcome.
And bye for now.
Thank you very much indeed for having me.
Thank you, Professor Dart. Thank you.
Cheers. Cheers, Daniel.
Well, thank you so much, Dad, for accepting the invitation.
Not at all. So what should I do now? How should I self-destruct?
There should be a red button with a telephone on. Just press that, as I'm going to do now.
Yeah. Cheers.
Okay.
Cheers. Bye.
Everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.